my lord.
He was purported to have been the handsomest man in London and also the most beautiful woman when he was acting the role of a woman. He was the greatest performer of women's roles in the English Restoration Theatre, and he has been that since he was a boy. And suddenly his career is threatened by the inclination of Charles II to ban men from doing women's roles, bring women back to the stage where they had been banned for the last 20 years.
My life is my art is the stage. Don't take a stage away.
I chose it because I think it has the basic element of opera in spades. I would say the essential ingredient in an opera libretto is a crisis. It's not just any other day, because of the fact that music heightens the emotional atmosphere so that if you do something that's very, very routine, it makes the music sound ridiculous and ridiculously overinflated. So you have to always provide in a libretto a situation which has all the elements of crisis. And this, of course, is a major crisis because it is the end of a man's career. The conflict and the events that emerge from the conflict are what I work with in an opera.
He's one of the few composers who writes words and music. Most opera composers are composing music to someone else's dramaturgical design and libretto. And Carlisle does that on his own.
Well, when Verdi accepted the commission for his final opera, Falstaff, he was a man of 80, and he said that he couldn't be expected to compose more than 2 hours a day. And I'm up to now about 2, sometimes 3. I never start the music until the libretto is really completed. I start with what is the color of the scene. In this case, it was a given because it was the final scene of Shakespeare's Othello, which is the prologue to the opera. So that was already solved for me because it was a scene of great foreboding and violence. I really listen to the inner ear, and then I find what I'm hearing. The inner ear dictates exactly what it wants to hear, and it can suggest a new idea. It can correct something that it considers faulty or could be better. When things begin to come and come very naturally, and that inner ear is working for you, it can be very exhilarating. And then you have a very good day.
But why are you taking care of me? Surely you know, or at least suspect. No, what? What must I suspect? That I love you, Ned. I love you. With all my heart I love you. There now, it's said at last.
Workshop in opera is becoming more and more popular in a way as a way of developing projects.
Well, the purpose is specifically for the, more than anything else, for the composer librettist to be able to see if what they've had in their heads up until this point comes out in a staging situation.
Can we do with you helping us out a lovely rendition indeed?
A lovely rendition indeed, but perhaps the city's music was more suited to Miss Queen's gift. And now, messieurs, what do you have for us? Oh, messieurs.
By having a week listening to the work, thinking, is it working? Is this really capturing my mind? Is it capturing my heart? Is the timing of on-stage events correct? Or is, say, an emotional moment of revelation, is it coming at the right time?
If I could try once more, we mustn't impose on you any longer. Kiniston, they tell me that the light of a star burns long after the star has died, even though it's not known to the star.
It can be reassuring, and also it can be very disturbing. It depends on how it runs and whether it's how close it is to your own concept of what it's going to look like.
The fact that you have the music staff in the room, you have the composer, which is a very rare privilege in the world of opera, and there's the director there who's already thinking about the physical aspects of the production, and there is the budget staff also looking and thinking, how they're going to do that. It's a great way to make sure that in a relatively brief rehearsal period, we will not be surprised halfway through just going, whoops, we can't do it, or whoops, this is not working.
The director in this case was somebody who's British and brought to it a special sensibility that I think an American director would have missed. And he also was very historically oriented. So he did a great deal of explaining to the cast, as we did rehearsals, what might have been the historical background for this particular scene, or how it had to be played, revealing that particular period. I think he filled them in on what the Restoration period was, and which I thought was very valuable for the singers to know. I was much more interested in just hearing the text and just seeing the pacing of the piece. Was it dragging at any point? If so, where was it? How could I trim it and fix it?
Workshopping's great. There's less pressure. We still had a lot of time to, go away, look at the score and learn the music. And then we came and we workshopped it. So we had learnt everything that was on the page, and we came into this week going, well, this little rhythm needs to change from da-da-da to dum-da-da because it fits the flow of the language better, and you can throw those ideas out. And it's kind of cool because when this eventually goes on stage, there'll be a little bit of everyone in this room this week that goes into the opera.
It's been a really interesting week, seeing the evolution of the piece in just such a short time, and it really has changed in a week. It's kind of amazing, actually.
But it was a complete run-through and gave me for the first time a sense of the whole opera. But it's just something that you have to learn to discipline yourself about, that you have to look at it with as critical eye as your conductor and director are, and not think it's just wonderful because it's yours and it's being done for the first time. The final dressing for the notes is the orchestra, and that's what's contained in an orchestral score. Without the orchestra, it's a skeleton, and you simply clothe it with the orchestral colors. I'm doing this opera for a reduced orchestra of 25, and I've never really done an orchestral score for 25, but it's a very small number of instruments to balance. So I'm eliminating what we call the lower brass, except trumpet and horns. pianist, and that's the way I was schooled, and I find it much easier for me to start with the piano and then orchestrate from what I see on the printed page for the piano. What you learn as a composer, and you learn it very early, is the ranges of the instruments, how the instruments sound in registers, different registers, low, medium, and high. And then the most difficult and intricate of all is the combination of instruments, putting instruments together. How do oboes sound when put with flute? There is so much possibility for color. It's infinite. And yet when you do an opera, you have to constantly concern yourself with overbalancing the singers. It's an infinite number and variety of combinations. But that's also the joy of working with the orchestra. There is so much possibility for color. It's infinite.
You haven't found any other errors since you got the score, just the ones that we talked about here?
Except the ones we've discussed.
Okay, good. Composers, certainly of Carlisle's generation, would write their compositions by hand. And from there, it would go to a copyist that would do a better job, let's say, and put it on the page to go to publication. But now that there's computers, it has changed dramatically for so many different reasons. We get the manuscript score from the composer, who goes through it, orchestrates his work, gives it to us. There's a lot of back and forth with the editor. Then he, what we call, signs off on the composition and gives it to me, and then I turn around and go through it again and give it out to a copyist to engrave in the computer. There's something very, very calm and clear about his music. That's one thing that I definitely notice when I look at the score for the first time, especially with his manuscript. When I first get the manuscript, it seems so clear, and that's very helpful to me, and that reflects on him as a composer and an orchestrator. So when I'm looking at the music, I'm not really that interested in what it sounds like in the initial. I mean, that's something that's a treat for me after the fact. But I'm looking at it as a technician and as a music editor for the technical parts of what's possible for the orchestra to play, and to make sure that there's nothing that will stop the rehearsal. What is that note that's impossible for? I have to catch that before it gets to that point. I love his orchestration, and some of the parts where it gets very intense. It's heartbreaking, this story, and the music reflects that. That's my favorite. He does that so well, because the story is so heartbreaking, and those parts where Keniston is so revealed, so vulnerable and humiliated, the music reflects that very well, and I have to say those are my favorite parts.
So first you need to identify your creative team, and then you have to make sure that they're available, that they're willing to work for whatever the contractual conditions are, that they can be there for the production period, that they can be there for the rehearsals, the final rehearsals, whatever other requirements are, and until they've signed the dotted line, you don't have them, and only then do you have them, and can you start putting the visuals or giving the visual dimension to the production.
So for me, it's thrilling to be designing something new. I'd much prefer when it's more challenging. It can also be much more rewarding. It's a world premiere, so to me, that's the most exciting thing. When you see that time period, it is overwrought with these crazy shapes and trimmings and bows and men in enormous wigs, and the men are almost really more elaborate than the women are. So trying to take such an elaborate time period and put it on a body and not have it seem so odd to today's eyes, that really is a challenge.
My role as a set designer is to provide the scenery, which is sort of the architecture of the piece, and also the props, all the furniture, like lamps, rugs, and then obviously the walls too. It's a quiet show mostly with two people on stage at a time. So I'm trying to keep the scenery less intrusive while evoking lots of different places. I think that was my biggest challenge.
We had some budget issues. Clearly the costume needed to take the majority of the money. Shoku has designed 3 different versions of Prince of Players. So when we do the Broadway transfer, we have that already designed. It was done. We couldn't afford that, and therefore Shoku was never once said, "Oh, woe is me, this is my set." She said, "Okay, how can I help?"
I went back to my research and I thought, well, maybe I take a lesson from the Dutch still life paintings that I've been really interested in and make it all black.
We do move places very quickly. The way that Shoku solved that was by a very simple turning turntable that has many different functions to it and can set you in different places very quickly. The simplicity of it allows also the costume to really be the piece, the moving scenery.
What I ended up speaking with Michael and Shoko about was designing all of the entire company in a black period base costume. So what this means is that all of the women would have a corset, chemise, skirt base costume, and all of the men would have a shirt, some type of breeches, petticoat breeches, something like that. And then when they became a specific character, the clothing would be in color, would go on top of that. If they were being used as some sort of chorus background, like in revels, etc., that means they would be just in this black base.
I can fake period. You know, we don't need to see the full Baroque-like splendor on stage. I can fake it, but Gregory cannot fake period clothing, especially if the King of England shows up a few times. You know, there's nothing you can do about that. So that was plan B.
It's more theatrical, it's more Brechtian in a way. It feels more modern and a little fresher and lighter in that it's not an enormous amount of period costumes. It is tricky to do this because what you're really trying to do is adding a minimal amount of costume pieces on top of this base, but each time someone would do that would make the performer look like they were making a full costume change. The costumes began several months later than was originally planned, so everyone had to put the pedal to the metal, so to speak, in all of the costume departments. It was a labor of love, 7 days a week, for many weeks in Houston. The shop was working extraordinarily hard to get all the costumes made in this much truncated time frame that we were dealing with.
Ultimately, Gregory and I ended up just sewing with everyone else from, I don't know, 9 a.m. to right before the orchestra rehearsal started. Because we found out the costume shop was not union, and so anyone could stitch there if they wanted to.
The ideal clearly would have been to have more time to do that work so that they could have spread it out over a longer period of time. And that eventually does compromise the number of costumes you can have, some of the finishes. But as you're right, as soon as they walk on stage, every person looks amazing.
I love my costumes. I love them because they are spectacular. I love Greg's work, and I love my looks, all of them. They're so special. And the tailors have done such a big, giant work on my costumes. I have 6 looks. 6.
You rarely get costumes made for you, and I had 3 or 4, and 2 of them being beautiful, expensive dresses, a couple of robes that were hand-painted that are just gorgeous. And the wigs are an interesting experience because at the time hair would be much longer, so I have to have my Keniston wig, and that has to be pinned up under my female wigs that go on, player being a player. So anytime you see me wearing my 2 female wigs, it's with my main wig under it and glued on.
It was absolutely vital that Keniston and Meg be plausibly very young. That's a very, very important part of this story, that Keniston has this great success and great failure at a young age.
I auditioned for Carlisle in October-ish, and then I did the studio auditions in January, and whenever I got my contract in mid-February, they had Keniston on it, and I was super psyched.
Night of the wedding, she crept into bed. Her cheeks were rosy, her ball was red.
Carlisle actually had identified Ben Edquist long before we at Houston Grand Opera knew Ben Edquist, because Jake Hagee saw Ben in Jake's opera, 3 Decembers, when Ben was a student at Vanderbilt University. And Jake, cognizant of Prince of Players and what the demands of that title role were going to be, sent all these tapes off to Carlisle. And Carlisle is the person who identified Ben before he auditioned for the HGO studio and became a member of our studio. It was quite, extraordinary circumstances.
About Margaret, it's very emotionally, very hard, heavy role. At the beginning, it was very hard for me to get that all the feelings combined. To be ambitious, to be a strong woman, to try out things, to try to be on the stage, to run away, to run to the other theater, to steal things from the Kinniston's dressing room and run away and then come back and pretend that she hadn't done that.
So I don't know. I hope I can pursue roles in the same, emotional vein, and because you don't get to do that a lot as a baritone. You don't get to sing a lot of emotionally intense roles, and it's just been an amazing experience and an amazing opportunity because it's Carlisle Floyd, and it's such a great role and such a great opera.
When you're working in opera, if you don't have the hair standing up on the back of your neck, once or twice a day when you're in rehearsal, you're probably clinically dead. So therefore, it's really to think on Saturday night we'll be sitting there listening to realistically the first proper playthrough of an opera that has been done by one of the absolute icons of the opera scene. That's going to be pretty cool.
But why are you taking care of me? Surely you know, or at least suspect. Know what? What must I suspect? That I